North Korea is the most unusual country on the planet. Separated by an iron curtain from the rest of the world, it is a subject of constant controversy. Some view North Korea's isolationist approach as exemplary, while others cite articles about starving people, the cult of personality and censorship, calling the country a tyrant. We don't claim that by the end of this video you'll come to a definitive conclusion. Our aim is to tell the story, and now you will learn how North Korea was formed, how it has brought the world to the brink of a third World War 3 times, and how it triggered the war between China and the USA. It will be very interesting, and even more interesting with your comments on whether you would like to visit North Korea, because it is such an unusual country. Before we delve into the past, you should know one simple fact that tells you more about North Korea than many hours of videos. In 2014, the World Cup has held in Brazil. North Korea didn't qualify, but its neighbors from South Korea decided to play a prank. A capitalist South Koreans edited a humorous video where footage from the World Cup was overlaid onto matches involving North Korea, creating the impression that North Korea won the World Cup. And what do you think happened? North Korea's only TV channel calmly broadcast the video, declaring it to be entirely true. As a result, all of North Korea still believes that their football team is the world champion because there is neither internet nor independent media in the country. But that's a side note. Now let's dive into history. In 1300 BC, a state formation appeared on the Korean peninsula. It was called Ancient Joseon and covered the entire territory without division into north and south. The exact date is still debated by scholars. Some say the prototype of Korea emerged in 300 BC, while others claim that Joseon was founded 4,000 years ago. Interestingly, its capital is considered to be ancient Pyongyang, not Seoul, which didn't even exist at that time. But that's not so important. What matters is that the country did indeed exist and lasted quite a long time. Moreover, in addition to the peninsula, it even controlled part of southern China. Historically, the Koreans had various degrees of relations with China. It was the Chinese Han Dynasty that, in 108 BC, destroyed and conquered the prototype of an independent Korea. For 1,000 years, the peninsula was under unclear authority. There were three kingdoms: Silla, Baekje, and Goguryeo. Only in 935 did the peninsula become unified again. It was then that the term Goryeo appeared, which later became the prototype of Korea. For several centuries, people developed culture and science, but later came under Mongol rule. Eventually, they managed to avoid it, and in 1392, the real Korea was born. Initially, it was called Joseon, and later the Korean Empire. It was at this stage that Seoul was founded and became the capital. And it was also at this stage that Japan intervened. Pirates from Japan had long raided Korea, but by the end of the 19th century, their claims turned into something more significant. In 1910, Korea became a Japanese colony. However, it wasn't all that bad. Under Japanese rule, life expectancy in Korea doubled, schools began to open, and it wouldn't be wrong to say that modern Korean culture is a Japanese legacy. Even the first university in Seoul was opened by Japanese governor General Saito Makoto. He also launched newspapers and banned corporal punishment. However, alongside the positives, there were also negatives, such as assimilation, purges, and other harsh realities of life. But as everyone knows, after World War II, Japan fell and Korea was once again free. This is where things get interesting, as it was destined to be free for only a few hours. The entire Korean peninsula was occupied by the armies of the USSR and the USA, which had just defeated Japan, and they were not satisfied with a large independent piece of land. Initially, as a temporary measure, Soviet troops occupied the north and American troops the south of the country. The division was along the 38th parallel, but was only a provisional measure. The two countries didn't want to divide Korea. They tried to establish a government, which turned out to be a failure, because the Soviets were interested in communism, while the US favored capitalism. As a result, on August 15, 1948, the Republic of Korea was proclaimed in the territory controlled by the Americans, with Seoul as its capital. And 3 weeks later, the USSR retaliated by establishing the Korean People's Democratic Republic. This happened just 70 years ago. We hope you now understand that there is no historical context behind the division of Korea. For millennia, a unified and homogeneous people lived on the peninsula, and the big players, the USA and the USSR, simply divided it to satisfy their imperial ambitions. They even drew the borders out of thin air, setting the lines where the military bases were located. Leave comments if you want to see a video about South Korea. But for now, we're interested in the north. and things were quite lively there. The ruler of the newly formed DPRK was captain of the Red Army Kim Song-ju, who later changed his name to Kim Il-sung. As is customary in any totalitarian country, a cult of personality immediately began around Kim Il-sung. Everything revolved around Kim Il-sung, and he had unlimited power thanks to the full support of the USSR and the rising communist China. Kim Il-sung immediately declared South Korea as the occupiers, and South Korea did the same in response, and with just a stroke of the pen by the USA and USSR, one of the most unstable regions in the world was created. Both sides called for war and the reunification of Korea, each side believing itself to be right. Only in 1949 did South Korea carry out 2,670 armed incursions, violated the airspace 71 times and the border 42 times. The neighbors were doing the same, and everyone understood that war was imminent. However, the examples of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were fresh, so the USSR was afraid to approve an operation. Kim Il-sung visited Moscow dozens of times and requested approval for a full-scale war, but was repeatedly denied. On the other hand, China hinted that it would gladly help North Korea in its confrontation, making the situation ambiguous. It became critical when the USSR tested its atomic bomb and became the second nuclear power on the planet. In March 1950, Kim Il-sung visited Stalin again, and this time Stalin finally approved the war. Officially, the USSR didn't participate in it, but by a happy coincidence, the DPRK army was packed with T-34 tanks, Soviet aviation and advisors. And 500,000 Chinese were called volunteers, although Beijing didn't officially enter the war. Initially, the DPRK was its own efforts captured Seoul and almost the entire peninsula. In the best tradition, on June 15, 1950, 175,000 troops crossed the South Korean border and with the support of tanks and aviation quickly countered almost everything. The US didn't believe in the war and was in shock. The much smaller South Korean army didn't have tanks and was defeated. 90% of its territory was captured by the DPRK, and it seems that all hope was lost. Only on September 15 did UN reinforcements begin a full-fledged response. British, US and Allied forces created a real day of judgment. Within a month, they reached Pyongyang and captured it. Do you think the fun ended there? Not at all. The arrival of 500,000 Seoul-scaled volunteers from China once again swung the pendulum. Taking advantage of the element of surprise, the Beijing troops, with the help of the USSR, defeated the Americans and recaptured Seoul. This would be fine if the war didn't involve thousands of casualties on both sides. By February 1951, the war had reached a deadlock. Both sides were essentially back to their original positions. Despite this and a few more years of clashes, negotiations at the UN continued. The decisive moment came with Stalin's death in 1953. After that, the USSR immediately announced its desire to end the war. It's important to understand that at the time South Korea was as, if not more, belligerent than the North. Just look at the border league they established. According to various estimates, its supporters executed between 60,000 and 1 million people accused of communist sympathies. For many years, the pro-American government denied this genocide, but the fact remains. During the peace negotiations of 1953, it was the USA and South Korea that rejected the terms of the armistice, but it was eventually achieved. And each country went its own way. South Korea gave birth to Samsung, LG, Kia, and other giant corporations. And North Korea. North Korea produced a lot of memes and tried to continue on its own path. After the rift between the USSR and China, Kim Il-sung developed an official ideology. It's called Juche, and its essence is simple. The North Korean people should achieve everything independently without outside assistance. In simpler terms, it's isolationism which keeps North Korea cut off from the rest of the world to this day. Whether this is good or bad is not for us to decide. However, even now, according to human rights advocates, a third of North Korea's population suffers from hunger. The most terrible instance is known in history as the Arduous March. Over 4 years from 1995 to 1999, it claimed between 10,000 and 3 million lives, according to various estimates. However, the government blames the West and its sanctions, which, as you know, are constantly imposed, mainly due to militarism and the loud rhetoric of the DPRK leaders. Since the 1970s, North Korea has been working on developing nuclear weapons, and in 2005, Kim Jong-il declared that North Korea had them. In 2015, his successor Kim Jong-un claimed that North Korea also possessed a hydrogen bomb. The US has long tried to pressure North Korea, but each attempt has failed. In the 1990s, Bill Clinton even discussed the possibility of a missile strike on the nuclear reactor in Yongbyon. But the idea was abandoned because South Korea is nearby and no one wanted a repeat of the war, as it could be even more destructive this time. As a result, a fragile order was established. Under it, the US continually demands that North Korea dismantle its nuclear stockpiles, imposing sanctions, while North Korea in turn fluctuates between preparing for war and declaring its intention to dismantle its weapons and join the global community. The current leader even met with Donald Trump, where progress in relations was discussed. However, almost immediately afterward, reports of new tests emerged, and everything returned to square one. North Korea truly is the most unusual country on the planet. The position of ruler is passed down by inheritance, and people can access the internet only with party permission and in strictly designated places. People don't know what happens beyond their country's borders. And yet they are Koreans just like South Koreans. It's just that 70 years ago powerful nations decided to test their strength, and as a result the once unified people remain divided to this day. The Korean War alone claimed nearly 4 million lives worldwide. It's no wonder that history is said to teach us nothing, and North Korea is a vivid example of the history that must be known. Until next time, friends.